Welcome to another weekly market insight where we try to sift through the noise to get to the signal to give you actionable advice so you can make informed decisions. Joining me today is Chris. We're going to cover the infrastructure bill today. But today is also November 10th, which is the 246th birthday of the United States Marine Corps. It's actually older than the country, at least if you go from the signing of the Constitution. So happy birthday, Marines, and hoorah, devil dogs that are out there. Tomorrow's Veterans Day, so if you know a veteran, make sure you thank him tomorrow. But let's get right into it today. So the infrastructure bill.
Did you spend the whole budget on this slide?
The entire
so
budget. Ira needed some homework. I told him, "Can you make this slide for me, please?" And he said, "Absolutely, Dad." No, I just wanted to keep it simple. Yeah. And the main point is there are two bills that are working, and a lot of the bills, it's really hard to keep them straight, especially since they move them back and forth depending on the bill. We have the infrastructure bill. The infrastructure is supposed to be a bipartisan bill, and then we have the Build Back Better bill. And that was $3.5 trillion, probably not going to be anywhere near that. And the thing is that the infrastructure would be bipartisan, and they would use reconciliation for Build Back Better. Now, the Speaker, Pelosi, required that the Democratic Senate get the Build Back Better bill passed before she would take the infrastructure bill. That didn't happen. And they did finally pass the infrastructure bill late in the evening.
The House.
The House,
Friday,
yes,
right?
because the Senate
had passed this a couple months ago, right?
Yeah, yes. So now there will be a shift to that reconciliation bill, but it's $1 trillion in infrastructure spending. Now the idea is that they're going to use reconciliation. The one thing that I would notice is the only reason the infrastructure bill passed, they didn't have a straight Democratic ticket. There needed to be Republicans coming over because there are some issues with the more progressive part of the wing. There were 6 defectors, so they're struggling to get a straight Democratic vote. So I got to think that they're going to still struggle to get that on the Build Back Better, especially whenever we look at the moderates.
Right. When you talk about, I haven't heard anything new from Manchin or Sinema, but it doesn't look like they have 50 votes for that, does it?
And we definitely are starting to see a smaller and smaller number. So what is in the bill? It's $1 trillion, at least the House version, because the Senate did $1.2 trillion, and it's for refurbishing aging roads, bridges, ports. We certainly need that, and easing transportation bottlenecks. Supply chain disruptions are certainly a problem. There's also replacing harmful lead pipes, expanding internet access, upgrading the nation's power grid, boosting infrastructure resilience amid growing concerns over climate change. So there's a lot in this bill. Let's start to unpack some of that bill.
But before you get too deep, and I know we will comment on policy, and we do that, but as an analyst, what are you specifically looking for when you say, well, this is bullish, this is bearish for the stock market, when you're looking at fiscal?
So when it comes to government, somebody's always going to win. I mean, there's always politics involved in this getting structured. And I think we want to understand who are going to be the beneficiaries in this, what are the long-term repercussions, how much of an impact is this going to be, what is the match of the timing of this versus the economic cycle, which I think we'll touch on. But we want to know basically how we should structure portfolios and what's a way to preserve clients' wealth and even add to it. So that's what we're trying to do. Certainly have our own political opinions on the viability of these, kind of leave those behind and try to focus on what's the impact on markets. When we look at the infrastructure bill spending, a lot of it is geared towards light rail, so like the Metrolink here in St. Louis, redoing intersections as well as having bike paths. I don't think this is going to make a big impact on the market. Most of these plans are not actually ready to go. So it's going to take some time to develop these, build them out, get a team. Another thing is you're going to have to get labor to be involved in this, and we're already at a labor shortage. So I don't know how much. I could tell you that any good or positive results are not going to be in time for the next election. Whenever we look at this infrastructure for 2022.
Because a lot of the spending is, some projects may start in 2022, but it looks like 2024 is probably when a lot of this gets rolled out.
Yes. So then what about the $66 billion for easing our commute with Amtrak? Well, one, who's going to benefit from that? It's mainly going to be the Northeast corridor where most of the Amtrak travel is. Now, $66 billion is a lot of money. $30 billion of it is just going to upgrade and trying to fix the wear and tear in that Northeast corridor. Now, they had $874 million in revenue in 2019. Because you don't want to use 2020 numbers because we were during the lockdown, so those numbers are going to be skewed. So if we think about that, this capital investment on the already revenue, if we did price to revenue, not price to earnings, we're talking about a 75 multiple. This just wouldn't be a good investment that we would make. And really, if we look at where does the revenue come from, it's mainly that Northeast corridor because density matters. Now, they do say that they want to expand it to the south and the west and add some high-speed rail at 180 miles an hour. And I think that is attractive and it sounds nice, but we already have planes that are doing 600. I don't know that this makes a lot of sense beyond that high-dense area. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say this is passenger rail, right? So this isn't anything yet that's going to help, some of the bottlenecks that we're hearing from some of the railroads when they're shipping actual goods.
Yeah. So this is Amtrak, and once again, the $568 million came from that Northeast corridor. They could probably make a profit there if you were looking to spin this off, make it private. The private business would probably only run trains there. They'd probably raise the price. But they had a negative $29.8 million revenue. So they lost money. Now, one of the things that I find interesting is a lot of the money is going to add carpet, update the bathrooms, all these. And I'm like, if you're not actually putting money back into the trains as maintenance and you're still running a loss, like if you're depreciating your asset and not actually building it up, that should actually make your profit margin look better. So I think there's a lot of concern here on how the money is being spent on these rails, on whether we're going to get an economic benefit from that. It certainly will help the Northeast section. And then there's also money set aside for electric vehicle charging units. Now, Tesla hit $1 trillion. I think it's now not at $1 trillion market cap after the last couple of days. But they're leading in building out these charging centers. Why is it that the government needs to add these charging centers? And
there's about 4 or 5 other public companies working on the same thing for charging centers.
Right, and how many individual gas stations are there now that sell petrol? So this is not like a losing opportunity. I think a lot of it is because no one wants to put a lot of the electrical charging vehicle stations in rural areas, because it doesn't make sense because of density. These electric vehicles have low ranges. They're really cool. They'll out-accelerate a combustion engine all day long, but they really only work in high-dense areas under the current technology. And we can see up there in that Northeast corridor where the trains make sense, that's where the electric vehicles are going to make sense. So there's some concern or question on why does this need to happen whenever there are companies that have an incentive to do it. Here's one that I think makes a lot of sense, is trying to solve the supply chain bottlenecks by having a competitive bidding system for freight enhancement. And the point that a commenter had made was, whenever you're doing some type of infrastructure spending, because you're looking for votes, it's geared more towards the average commuter, not freight. So if you look at Chicago, the rails that are going through, they probably haven't been up. It's probably the same pattern that was there 150 years ago. So it's not really been updated. It doesn't get much attention. Instead, the roads and other things, because of I think that's a solid point. Now, the other thing they said is getting access to capital. Well, at interest rates at this low, how is it difficult to get access to capital? So we'll see, but I do think that there's some really good points that have been made regarding that freight. Was it the comments?
I was just going to say, another point on fiscal policies. A lot of times you aim to be counter-cyclical, right? Make investments while the economy's struggling. So what do you think about this? We're making investments while the economy's going a little bit now?
Yeah, whenever we look at the political rhythm of things, it seems that we're off the economic cycle. So if you remember, the Trump tax cuts were done at a market peak at the time. There wasn't a need to stimulate the economy, so those were done at a high. Typically, you want to do projects like this while the economic cycle is in the downturn. There's excess labor, there's commodity prices that are low because we have deflationary pressure. This kind of has that multiplier effect. So this is just like the tax cuts. This seems to be off of the economic cycle where it would make sense.
But like you also said, some of the spending could be in 2024. So, not really sure
right.
where the economy will be at that point. We do know that the labor is going to be an issue.
Yes. And then another area is getting broadband access to rural areas. And I like to be out in rural Missouri. It's such a beautiful state. And I'm going to benefit from this as this goes through. But there are large multinational and large capitalized companies with the AT&T, Charter, et cetera, that can do this and have chosen not to. Now, just because the government does it, if it's an economic loss and basically the inputs don't get earned for the outputs, so there's no profit in doing it,
right.
That's true whether it's AT&T or the government. And I think people will make arguments that people need access, they can't afford access. So this is politics,
right.
But why isn't AT&T, if this is a good thing, why are they not doing it? And it's because it's going to be an economic loss on doing
the government's probably better at taking losses than AT&T.
Oh, they're very good at taking losses. Remember, the Amtrak was running negative. Another thing, and I think this falls right in the classic example of where a government can get involved and should get involved because the market can't solve the issue easily. The incentives are not aligned, and that's lead pipes, especially in residential areas. This is a health hazard, or is considered a health hazard, and if you don't have the money to replace those pipes, doesn't matter how much of a health hazard it is. So there is funding set aside for trying to replace some of the aging lead containing pipes. So I think this is an area that it makes sense from the classical understanding of when a government should get involved. And then we have power lines and just the resiliency of it. So we've seen, I think there was 22 events that happened last year where there were brownouts or blackouts where people lost power. $22 billion, I think, is, if I remember right, is off memory, on how much revenue or economic activity was lost to this. We certainly have a resiliency problem, and the government is setting this off. And specifically with climate change, you take Texas, we did a long discussion about this where the amount of renewables, low-cost energy that they have isn't resilient enough, and then they also had a kind of perfect storm with being ill-prepared with natural gas as a substitute. Having transnational power lines where you can shift energy from one area of the country to the other, so you may have bad weather in one area but good weather in the other, that makes sense to make it resilient. But there's one hand, the government's doing good on resiliency, but at the other hand, they're also trying to make it more difficult for resiliency. And one of the examples is just here locally. Spire has a pipeline that goes through St. Louis, went through all the approvals, and is now needed to supply gas. And I got this warning earlier last week saying that there is a potential for disruptions because a New York environmental group has gotten a government court the rule that this needs to be shut down by December 13th. And there's other pipelines. So it's just, which way are we going?
Right.
Are we trying to do resiliency? It's hard to say, and just know that governments have different factions, so one will move one way while the other one is doing a counter move as well, so that it's not as easy as, hey, resiliency, we're going for resiliency. Definitely makes sense on the better power grid, but then why are we doing this if that's the stated goal? So then, how are we going to pay for this?
Amtrak profits?
Amtrak profits, yes. Extended mandatory sequester. Well, there you go. That's how we're going to pay for it. Makes sense. Well, what is that? And I had never heard of it, and I had to go track this down. So they are planning to cut Medicare by 2% to help reduce some of their expenses. They're considering that now revenue coming back to them. What's interesting is this is a trick that they've been using for quite some time, all the way to the 1980s, and they've never done it. So they're saying, hey, we're going to cut Medicare by 2%. That's going to provide some of the revenue to pay for it. Probably not going to happen. Selling 5G spectrum. Okay, weren't we doing that already? did we count that elsewhere? I'm sure it was counted, so it seems like this is some double counting. Selling oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Well, there's oil stock, which is the reserve, and there's oil flow. And if you want to punish OPEC because they're getting our prices high by dumping stock, well, you can only do that so long because you only have so much. And it may be a good time to sell oil. Maybe the price is high. I'm certainly feeling it at the gas station. But that assumes that the price is going to be lower because you're going to have to replenish it at some point. So I don't know how much revenue this is really going to add and whether that's going to end up costing us more as we have to replace it at some times. Reduce the tax cap. Well, what do they mean by that? Hiring more IRS agents. So this is one of those things that has moved back and forth between the bills. It was in here. There was an interesting statistic that their goal is to have 70% callbacks if you call the IRS by hiring new individuals. And you know where it was during the COVID pandemic?
20%?
That would be a success. No, it was all the way down to 7%. I was surprised because I thought 70% as a goal, as a callback. We would consider that a failure here at GWS to only call back 70% of the time. But when you're going off 7%, that's a pretty big improvement. And then here's a bowl of noodles to try to unwind. Macroeconomic impact of infrastructure investment. I think we'll touch on that on the next slide here. But even with this, the projections, which are almost always over optimistic, they never turn out as good as they estimate, assumes that we'll add $256 billion to the debt over the next 10 years. Now, I don't know, I've kind of become numb to the numbers, right? Yeah. 256 over 10 years, that's nothing. We did $6 trillion. Right. So probably not a big impact, but we know that it's going to be higher than that.
Right, and they're moving around some funds, right, from things that weren't spent during COVID bills, but doesn't look like they're hitting, that the Treasury's going to hit the market with too much issuance. You know, yields have actually been down, so passing of this has not scared the Treasury market.
Right, and then when we look at those multipliers of macroeconomic impact, it's so hard to gauge. Like you had said, we're at different cycles. We're not in a recession at the moment.
You could get up to 2.2 from infrastructure. That's why it's so popular with politicians, right? They think you can get, it's really the highest bang for your buck, potentially, when you're looking at spending, because tax cuts are only at about 1.5 and corporate tax cuts at 0.4.
Right, but then look at the range, 0.4 to 2.2. Right. One, you've lost 60% of the money that you gave in economic activity. Another one, you could get up to 2.2 or 220% of what you spent out of the economy. So inflation, one of the statements that I heard from the president was, this infrastructure bill will help offset inflation. Now, I believe that inflation is ultimately a monetary policy phenomena. So expanding the money supply, I think, is only going to get it. And then whenever we look at inflation, I personally like the bacon index. And I think this picture really captures just what we're feeling for inflation. Bacon's now at $10 a pound. Actually, it says 15 ounces, so it's actually even more than that. We are seeing prices. For me, this picture speaks loudly on the way that I'm feeling inflation at the moment.
And probably what he meant is he thought there's some way that they could help with the supply bottlenecks, but kind of as we went through there, we said it really doesn't look like there's any near-term help.
Right. So one of the ways you can expand the money supply, but if production goes up more than the growth of the money supply, you'll see the price index move down on goods. And that's his point, is that we need to increase the production capacity, the ability to distribute goods, and that will bring down cost. And it's a fair point, but as a person that sees monetary policy as the root cause of inflation and saying that by expanding and spending more, we're going to get less, that jumps out at me.
Moving from the bacon index to the CPI, got a number earlier this morning, red hot number, 0.9 on the month. That's very high. It's higher than we've had. It's 11% annualized rate on the month. Looking back, it's 6.2, which is still very high. And historically, I've been looking the last few months at core inflation, removing some of the noise from energy and food, which I know you don't do, but I had seen that, and the Fed likes it. They see it coming down at 0.3, 0.1, and 0.2. So they're on a very nice trend for core inflation. Well, 0.6 this month. So they completely broke trend. and prices are moving up.
Yeah, so it's so far has not been transitory, and it's now going in the wrong direction for that narrative for sure.
Right.
Hopefully next month we'll see a cool down and so on.
Gold and Bitcoin immediately popped off this number.
Yeah.
Gold up over $18.50 an ounce, and Bitcoin over 68,000 from that number.
So definitely some hedges. So who gains from this? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do. Who cares what our beliefs are in politics? They just, politics is just what they are. So what can we do? Well, the market, I think, likes that there are no new taxes in this bill. They would much prefer deficit spending over, hey, we've got this neutralized and we've raised the revenue from the economy to pay for the items that we want to do. I think also large corporations are really able to offload a lot of their CapEx spending. Take the internet. AT&T and Charter are going to have the government help them lay the lines that they're going to be able to bill on. Now, one of the other things that they're dealing with, it's not just getting the access. There's also affordability components where they'll help people that can't afford the access to it. But when we look at this, there's just a lot of CapEx that really should be done at the company level that is getting pushed off to the U.S. government. Biggest probable winner, though, would be the industrials. That they tend to benefit most. We were looking at the correlation to GDP as it goes up. Industrials definitely pick up
significantly
here.
Higher than all the other asset classes.
But we also think that all of this is already known. And it's likely priced into the market at the moment.
I would say, at the moment. In the short term, like you said, there's a lot of unknowns of what could happen in 2024. But at least in the short term, it looks like it's priced in.
Right. So then, unemployment rate. Good news is we're now below 5%, so we're down at 4.8%. So that those are strong numbers there.
Very good jobs number on Friday. 531,000 jobs added in October, and upward revision from the September number as well for about an extra 100,000 jobs.
So we're going in the right way. I think we talked about how there's 25 million jobs lost, 20 million, and if we look at just historically, we considered, from an economic standpoint, full employment at 5% or below because there's always that friction, people making job changes. I think we got a little used to 3%. That's probably abnormal. We're probably more normalized at this point. But we have labor shortages, so we definitely can go further down. There's not a shortage of what to do. So then what's next is the Build Back Better. It's a bill that it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. A lot of the strategies that were put in place over the last month have not come to fruition. I definitely don't see a $3.25 trillion bill getting through. It's probably going to be smaller if it is able to get through, because a lot of these results aren't going to show up in time for the next election. So let's see what happens. Also, December 3rd, we're going to be talking about the debt ceiling expansion again. So there's a lot of noise here. And when do they come? Do you remember what day they come back from recesses?
Next week, I think.
I think, yeah, right? The 15th, isn't it? I think so. So then, almost through earnings, and we got a lot of names that we don't necessarily recognize anymore.
No,
so
a lot of our companies are already reported. A lot of the indexes already reported. I think, at least in the short term, for earnings helping with the stock market, that's probably behind us now. Really, only company left to report in our portfolio is Disney today.
So we've talked about this enough, I think, over our last few weeks. Let's just go near new highs in the market, continuing to move up. Really like those unemployment numbers that we talked about before. I'm sure the CPI will move it up today as well.
Right. And the market finally moved off of a strong jobs report. Right? In the history, the last several months, right, a strong jobs number meant, well, the Fed is going to have to slow down accommodation, but they already announced that last week that they're starting their taper, reducing their asset purchases by $15 billion a month for the next 2 months, and going to reevaluate in January.
And then when we look at our technical charts, basically you want to be in anything that's U.S. market cap, especially on the growth side, but most of the mid and small are also moving there. It seems that it's not just the large corporations, but kind of Main Street type of businesses, those small and medium businesses are picking up. It's nice to see the S&P 500 pretty much in the middle, and most of our positions were definitely U.S. favored, so we've had a good week in the portfolio. We'll talk about performance. We've been looking and watching our dashboard. Haven't gotten this fully calibrated. It may not look it here, but we actually are starting to see a nice basing in these, and this bullish percent index is measuring how many stocks are making new highs versus how many are making new lows. That's very strong. Money supply is beginning to move up. The yield curve is still flatter than it was a month ago, but it's stable, it's not negative. So things are starting to really churn in the market, and we're becoming more, we're looking more at should we raise cash to fill those cash targets again, other than we need to think about what positions we would have if we need to get defensive. So we're definitely feeling that change and seeing that change in the data in the investment committee. Any other things that we should cover?
No.
All right, well, once again, happy birthday to all the Marines out there. We really appreciate you tuning in. Go ahead and like it if you want to give other Marines a happy birthday. They will consider any likes a birthday wishes to those devil dogs. And then subscribe if you haven't already, and that arrow, share it to your friends, especially if they're Marines, so they can hear it, our congratulations on a happy birthday. We will look forward to seeing you next week.